Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into one of history's most nightmarish scenarios, a world where death doesn't knock. It kicks down your door and moves in permanently. We're diving into Athens, 430 BCE, where the greatest civilization of the ancient world is about to discover that all their philosophy, democracy, and military might means absolutely nothing when an invisible enemy comes calling. Forget what you think you know about ancient diseases being just another flu. The truth? You probably wouldn't last 3 days in this biological hellscape. And if you somehow survived, you'd wish you hadn't. So before we enter this medical nightmare together, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you're ready for some truly disturbing historical realities that'll make modern pandemics look like a minor inconvenience. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from tonight. It's incredible to see who's brave enough to explore these dark chapters of human suffering with me. Now dim those lights. Maybe grab something strong to drink. Picture the marble columns of the Parthenon gleaming in the Mediterranean sun. And let's ease into this tale together. The story of how the Athens plague turned the birthplace of democracy into a city of the walking dead. Congratulations, you've just woken up in Athens. Spring of 430 BCE. You stretch in your modest home near the Agora, breathing in what you think is just another beautiful morning in the greatest city-state the world has ever known. The air carries the familiar sense of olive oil, fresh bread, and that particular Mediterranean warmth that makes you grateful to be alive. You have no idea you're living in the final moments of normalcy your city will ever experience. As you make your way through the bustling streets, Athens feels invincible. This is the golden age of Pericles. After all, democracy is flourishing, philosophy is advancing, and the arts are reaching heights that will inspire humanity for millennia. The Parthenon, recently completed, dominates the skyline like a crown jewel of human achievement. But here's what you don't know, and what no one in Athens knows. There's already an invisible assassin stalking through your streets. It's been traveling for months, maybe years, working its way up from Ethiopia, through Egypt, across the Mediterranean. It's patient, methodical, and absolutely devastating. The irony is delicious in the most horrific way possible. While Athens prides itself on being the intellectual center of the world, home to the greatest minds and most rational thinkers, they're about to be completely blindsided by something they can't see, can't understand, and can't fight. You notice more people than usual crowding into the city, refugees from the countryside, fleeing the Spartan invasion that everyone's been talking about. Pericles' strategy is simple: let the Spartans burn the farms, but keep everyone safe behind Athens' mighty walls. It's a brilliant plan. Really, what could go wrong? Everything. Absolutely everything. The refugees bring with them not just their possessions and livestock, but something else, something microscopic and merciless. They're packed into the city like sardines, sleeping in temples, cramming into relatives' homes, setting up makeshift shelters wherever they can find space. It's the perfect breeding ground for disaster. You help your new neighbors settle in, sharing water from the communal fountains, breaking bread together, showing them around your beloved city. You're being a good Athenian citizen, embodying the values of hospitality and community that make Athens great. You're also signing your own death warrant. It starts innocently enough. A few people complaining of headaches, some redness in their eyes, Nothing you'd normally worry about, certainly nothing that would make you think the world is about to end. But then something changes. The complaints become more frequent, more urgent. People start describing violent heats in their heads, as if someone's lighting fires behind their eyeballs. Their eyes don't just look red anymore, they look like they're bleeding from the inside. You wake up one morning and immediately know something's wrong. Your head feels like it's been split open with an axe, then set on fire for good measure. Your throat feels raw, bloody, and when you try to speak, the most foul, putrid breath imaginable escapes your lips. It's like the smell of rotting meat mixed with sulfur, a stench so horrible that even you can't stand it coming from your own mouth. The sneezing starts next. Violent, body-racking sneezes that feel like they're trying to tear your face off. Your voice becomes a raspy whisper, barely recognizable as human. Then comes the cough, a deep, painful hack that feels like it's ripping your chest apart from the inside. You try to eat something, anything, but your stomach rebels instantly. Bile of every color imaginable, yellow, green, black, pours out of you. The retching is so violent that you feel like your ribs might crack. Some people around you vomit until there's nothing left, then keep vomiting anyway, their bodies spasming uncontrollably. But here's the really terrifying part. You're not pale and weak like you'd expect from someone this sick. Your skin is flushed, almost reddish, breaking out in small pustules and ulcers that seem to appear by the hour. You look vigorous, healthy even, despite feeling like you're dying from the inside out. The internal burning is the worst part. It's like someone has replaced your blood with molten metal. You can't bear even the lightest clothing against your skin. Linen feels like sandpaper, wool like torture devices. You strip down completely, but even the air touching your skin feels unbearable. All you want, all anyone wants, is cold water. You fantasize about diving into the ocean, about burying yourself in snow that doesn't exist in Mediterranean Greece. Some people actually do throw themselves into the public cisterns, desperately trying to cool the fire burning inside them. It doesn't help. Nothing helps. Sleep becomes impossible. Your body refuses to rest, keeping you in a constant state of agony and awareness. You can feel every pulse of blood through your veins, every beat of your heart echoing in your skull like thunder. The physicians are baffled. These are supposedly the most learned men in the world, trained in the rational methods of Hippocrates, versed in the theory of bodily humors and natural healing. They examine patients, prescribe their usual remedies, and watch in horror as nothing works. Worse than that, they start dying themselves. The doctors, the healers, the people who are supposed to save everyone else, are dropping faster than anyone. They spend the most time with the sick, and whatever this plague is, it seems to have a particular appetite for those who dare to come close. You watch your own physician, a man you've trusted for years, succumb to the same symptoms he's been trying to treat. His death is particularly cruel. He maintains his professional composure almost until the end, still trying to help others even as his own body betrays him. The temples are packed with desperate people making offerings to the gods. They sacrifice animals, burn incense, pray to every deity they can think of. Nothing happens. The gods, it seems, have either abandoned Athens or are actively punishing it for some unknown crime. The oracles are consulted, but their vague pronouncements offer no comfort. Some people remember an old prophecy about a Dorian war bringing death, and arguments break out about whether the word was actually death or dearth. As if it matters now. What's truly horrifying is how the disease seems to choose its victims. It doesn't care if you're rich or poor, young or old, strong or weak. The mightiest athletes collapse alongside elderly philosophers. Babies die in their mother's arms, while some ancient grandparents somehow survive unscathed. You notice something else that sends chills down your spine. The animals won't touch the dead bodies. Dogs, birds, even the rats that usually swarm over any available food source. They all avoid the plague victims like the corpses are made of poison. When some desperate animals do try to feed on the dead, they die quickly afterward. This isn't just a disease. It's something fundamentally wrong with the natural order. By the 7th day of your illness, you realize you might actually survive this nightmare. About half the people who get this far do make it through, though many emerge forever changed, blind, deaf, or with their fingers and toes simply gone, rotted away by the disease. But survival brings its own horrors. You watch your city transform into something unrecognizable. The bodies are everywhere. Athens, the shining beacon of civilization, is now dotted with corpses in various stages of decay. The normal burial rites have completely broken down. There aren't enough healthy people to properly honor the dead, and there isn't enough wood for funeral pyres anyway. You see things that will haunt you forever. Families throwing their loved ones onto strangers' funeral pyres because they can't afford their own. People sneaking out at night to dump bodies on existing fires, stealing the last dignity from the dead. Sons abandoning fathers, wives fleeing husbands, parents leaving children to die alone because the terror of infection has overcome every human bond. The social fabric that held Athens together is disintegrating. People who spent their entire lives trying to live honorably, following the laws and customs that made them civilized, suddenly decide that none of it matters. If you might die tomorrow, why not steal today? Why not indulge every desire, break every rule, take everything you want? Respect for the gods vanishes. Sacred spaces become refugee camps, filled with corpses. People who once wouldn't dare enter a temple without proper purification now treat them like public toilets. But priests are mostly dead anyway. The law becomes meaningless. Who's going to arrest you? Who's going to put you on trial? Half the judges are dead, and the other half are too busy trying to survive. Murder, theft, adultery, everything becomes acceptable because everyone expects to die before facing consequences. You watch wealthy merchants giving away their fortunes because money means nothing when there's nothing to buy and no one to sell it. You see philosophers abandon their life's work because wisdom feels pointless when death comes randomly and without meaning. Let's talk numbers, because the scale of this catastrophe is almost impossible to comprehend. Athens, at this time, has a population of roughly 400,000 people. By the time the plague finally burns itself out, somewhere between 1/4 and 1/3 of the entire population is dead. Think about that. In a modern city, that would be like losing everyone in Cleveland, or having the entire population of Miami just disappear. But this is worse than any modern pandemic because there are no hospitals, no understanding of disease transmission, no antibiotics, no nothing, just death. spreading through the most advanced city in the world like wildfire through dry grass. The military numbers are even more staggering. Remember that expedition to Potidaea? 4,000 elite Athenian soldiers went out. Within 40 days of the plague reaching them, over 1,000 were dead. These weren't sick old men. These were the best warriors Athens had, in the prime of their lives, and the plague carved through them like they were made of paper. Entire families are wiped out. Bloodlines that have existed for centuries vanish in a matter of weeks. The genetic and cultural knowledge of generations disappears forever. Craftsmen who spent decades perfecting their skills die before they can pass on their techniques. Scholars who held vast libraries of knowledge in their heads take it all to mass graves. The economic impact is immediate and devastating. Who's going to work the shops when the shopkeepers are dead? Who's going to maintain the aqueducts, repair the buildings, keep the city functioning? Athens has built this magnificent civilization, and now it's watching it crumble, not because of any enemy army, but because of something they can't even see. Perhaps the cruelest aspect of this plague is how it destroys not just bodies, but minds and souls. You see people you've known your entire life transform into creatures you no longer recognize. The fear becomes a living thing, stalking through the streets alongside the disease. People become suspicious of everyone. Your neighbor might be infected, your friend might be carrying death, your own family might be the source of your doom. The bonds of trust that hold society together snap under the strain. Some people become utterly reckless, embracing a philosophy of immediate gratification because tomorrow might never come. Others become paralyzed by terror, hiding in their homes and refusing to interact with anyone. Both responses are rational, and both are ultimately futile. You watch strong men weep like children when they see the first symptoms appearing on their bodies. You see women abandon their babies not out of cruelty, but out of a desperate hope that maybe, somehow, the children will have a better chance without them. The psychological torture of not knowing who will live and who will die is almost worse than the physical symptoms. At least when you're vomiting blood, you know something's wrong. But this disease strikes randomly, capriciously, like a malevolent god playing dice with human lives. The survivors develop a particular kind of madness, a dangerous confidence born from having faced death and won. They start to believe they're invincible, that having survived the plague means they're immune to everything. It's not true, of course, but try telling that to someone who's watched the world end and lived to tell about it. Throughout this catastrophe, Pericles maintains his calm, rational demeanor. He continues to give speeches about Athenian greatness, about enduring hardship, about not giving in to despair. His words ring hollow when half your family is dead. The people who once worshipped Pericles as the greatest leader of their generation now blame him for everything. It was his war strategy that packed everyone into the city. It was his decision to let the Spartans burn the countryside while keeping everyone trapped behind the walls. In their grief and rage, they hold him personally responsible for every death. They fine him, strip him of his offices, and treat him like a criminal. Then, in the fickle way of crowds, they realize that he's still the most competent leader they have and put him back in power. But the damage is done. The faith in leadership, in the ability of wise men to guide the city through crisis, has been shattered. Pericles himself eventually succumbs to the plague. Along with his sons and much of his family, the greatest statesman of the age dies not in glorious battle, or peaceful old age, but puking blood in a city full of corpses, just another victim of an enemy he couldn't fight with words or weapons. His death marks the end of an era. The men who come after him are smaller figures, more concerned with personal advancement than civic duty. The plague hasn't just killed people, it's killed the idea that noble leadership and rational planning can overcome any challenge. What you're witnessing isn't just a medical disaster, it's the beginning of the end for the golden age of Athens. The city will recover, sort of, but it will never be the same. The confidence, the sense of destiny, the belief that Athens is specially favored by the gods, all of that dies along with the plague victims. The war against Sparta continues, but Athens fights it now with diminished resources and broken morale. The grand strategy that might have worked with a healthy, confident population becomes a recipe for disaster when executed by a traumatized, depleted city. The cultural impact is equally devastating. Think of all the potential philosophers, artists, and scientists who died as children during the plague. What works of genius were lost when their creators perished? What discoveries went unmade? The trajectory of human civilization itself has been altered by this invisible catastrophe. The religious implications are staggering. How do you maintain faith in gods who allow such random, senseless suffering? How do you believe in divine justice when the good and evil die with equal randomness? The plague doesn't just kill bodies. It kills belief systems that took centuries to develop. Even the survivors are forever changed. They've seen civilization collapse, watched their neighbors abandon all moral restraint, lived through a period when the normal rules of human behavior simply didn't apply. How do you go back to caring about things like civic duty and personal honor after that? If you somehow make it through the acute phase of the illness, you're not out of the woods yet. The plague has a special cruelty reserved for its survivors. Many people lose fingers and toes to the disease, not all at once, but gradually. As the extremities simply rot away and fall off, others lose their sight entirely. You might survive the fever, the vomiting, the internal burning, only to discover that you'll spend the rest of your life in darkness. Some lose their hearing, condemned to live in silence while the world continues around them. Worst of all are those who lose their memories. They wake up from the plague knowing nothing, not their names, not their families, not their own histories. They become living ghosts, walking through a world where everyone recognizes them, but they recognize no one. The lucky survivors, if you can call them that, are left with a terrible knowledge. They've seen what humans become when the facade of civilization falls away. They've watched neighbors steal from corpses, seen friends abandon dying relatives, witnessed the complete breakdown of everything that supposedly makes us better than animals. This knowledge changes you fundamentally. You can't look at your fellow citizens the same way anymore. You know what they're capable of when pushed to extremity. Every social gathering, every civic ceremony, every normal human interaction is now shadowed by the memory of what you've seen. Perhaps the most terrifying aspect of the entire plague is the complete absence of divine intervention. Athens is a deeply religious city, where people genuinely believe the gods take an active interest in human affairs. They built magnificent temples, performed countless sacrifices, followed religious law with scrupulous care, and in return, nothing. Silence. The gods either can't help or won't help. And frankly, it's hard to say which possibility is more disturbing. You remember all the stories about divine intervention, how the gods helped heroes in their time of need, how proper piety was always rewarded, how justice eventually prevailed. Those stories feel like cruel jokes, Ro. What piety could possibly deserve this punishment? What justice could allow children to die in such agony? The priests try to maintain their authority, insisting that this is all part of some greater divine plan that mortals simply can't understand. But their words ring hollow when they're said by men whose own families are dying just like everyone else's. Some people decide the gods must be dead themselves. Others conclude that they're actively malevolent, that humanity is being punished for some cosmic crime. A few maintain their faith through sheer stubborn determination, but even they admit they don't understand why this is happening. The religious vacuum left by this crisis will eventually be filled by new philosophies, new ways of understanding the world that don't rely on divine protection. But in the moment, you're living through the collapse of an entire worldview, watching an entire people lose their faith in real time. By the time the plague finally runs its course, Athens is not the same city it was before. Physically, it's scarred, buildings left empty, temples defiled, public spaces that once hosted philosophical debates now serving as mass graves. But the deeper changes are in the people themselves. The survivors are harder, more cynical, less trusting. They've been through something that strips away illusions about human nature and divine protection. The optimism that once characterized Athenian culture has been replaced by a grimmer, more realistic worldview. The democracy continues to function, but it's different now. Decisions are made by people who have watched their world collapse and rebuilt it through sheer stubborn determination. They're less likely to trust grand pronouncements about glory and honor, more focused on practical survival. The artistic and intellectual flowering that marked the Golden Age continues, but with a darker tone. The tragedies become more tragic, the philosophical investigations more focused on suffering and mortality. Beauty is still created, but it's beauty marked by the knowledge of how quickly everything can be destroyed. As one of the survivors, you carry within you the memory of what Athens was like before the plague, when people believed in progress, when the future seemed bright, when human reason and divine favor seemed sufficient to overcome any challenge. You also carry the memory of what people become when those beliefs are stripped away. You've seen kindness and cruelty, heroism and cowardice, all mixed together in the same individuals depending on circumstances. The comfortable categories of good and evil seem much less clear now. When younger Athenians, who don't remember the plague, complain about minor hardships, you have to bite your tongue. They don't know what real catastrophe looks like. They can't imagine how quickly everything they take for granted could disappear. But you also recognize that this ignorance is a kind of blessing. Society needs people who believe in progress, who think the future will be better than the past, who are willing to build and create and hope. The plague tried to kill that optimism, but somehow, in some people, it survived. Here's something they don't tell you about surviving a catastrophe. The guilt is almost worse than the suffering. Why did you live when others died? What made you special? Was it just random chance? Or is there some cosmic injustice at work? You look around at the other survivors and see the same questions in their eyes. None of you have good answers. The plague didn't discriminate based on virtue or vice, on strength or weakness, on anything that would make sense. It just killed, randomly and remorselessly, until it was finished. This randomness is perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the entire experience. Humans need patterns, need meaning, need to believe that outcomes are somehow connected to actions. But the plague taught a different lesson, that sometimes terrible things happen for no reason at all, and all our wisdom and preparation and moral behavior count for nothing. Living with this knowledge is its own kind of burden. How do you motivate yourself to be good when goodness offers no protection? How do you plan for the future when you've seen how quickly the future can be stolen? How do you love others when you know how easily they can be taken away? These are the questions that will haunt Athens for generations. The plague is over, but its psychological aftermath will shape the city's culture for decades to come. The summer drags on, and the plague shows no signs of mercy. If anything, it seems to be getting stronger, more virulent, as if feeding on the city's despair. You watch from your window as another funeral procession passes, except there are no more proper processions anymore. Just carts loaded with bodies being wheeled toward the mass burial pits outside the city walls. Then comes news that stops your heart. Pericles himself is showing symptoms. The man who has led Athens through its greatest triumphs, who stood before the assembled citizens just months ago and delivered that magnificent funeral oration honoring the war dead, is now fighting for his own life against an enemy that doesn't care about political speeches or military strategy. You remember his words about how Athens is the school of Hellas, how Athenian citizens are uniquely equipped to handle any emergency, how hollow those words sound now, when even their speaker is reduced to the same helpless suffering as everyone else. Pericles tries to maintain his dignity even while dying. He refuses to give in to despair, continues to offer counsel to the city's remaining leaders, attempts to project strength even as his body betrays him. But you can see it in his eyes, the same terror that grips everyone else, the same dawning realization that all human achievement means nothing when biology turns against you. His death, when it comes, feels like the final nail in Athens' coffin, not just because he was a great leader, but because his passing proves that literally no one is safe. If the plague can take Pericles, brilliant, powerful, beloved Pericles, then it can take anyone. The funeral is a grim affair, nothing like the elaborate ceremonies that would normally honor such a man. There's no time for proper mourning, no resources for grand gestures, just another body in the ground, another family destroyed, another reminder that the natural order has completely collapsed. But here's the truly insane part. Athens doesn't surrender, even with a quarter of the population dead or dying, even with their greatest leader gone, even with their city transformed into something from the deepest nightmares. They keep fighting the war against Sparta. You watch in amazement as military expeditions continue to sail out of Piraeus, ships loaded with soldiers who might be carrying the plague to new territories, led by commanders who are probably half mad with grief and trauma, pursuing strategies that were designed by dead men for a world that no longer exists. The logic is brutal but inescapable. Surrender now means everything your dead have suffered for was meaningless. The only way to honor their memory is to continue the fight, no matter how hopeless it seems. You see the ships departing for Potidea, that damned city that's been under siege for what feels like forever. 4,000 of Athens' best soldiers sailing away from a plague-ravaged homeland to continue a siege that has already cost more than anyone ever imagined it would. The irony is devastating. These soldiers are fleeing a biological disaster only to sail directly into another one. The plague follows them like a curse, turning their military expedition into a floating nightmare of death and disease. Within 40 days, over 1,000 of those 4,000 elite troops are dead, not from Spartan spears or arrows, but from the same invisible killer that's been stalking Athens. The plague doesn't care about military formations or tactical brilliance. It just kills, efficiently and without discrimination. Think about what this means in practical terms. Athens has just lost roughly 25% of an entire military expedition to disease. These weren't random citizens. These were hand-picked warriors, the cream of Athenian military might, men who had survived countless battles and campaigns, and they died puking blood in their tents, probably crying for their mothers, reduced to the same helpless agony as everyone else. All their training, all their courage, all their experience, completely useless against an enemy they couldn't fight. The commanders who survive face an impossible choice: continue the siege with a decimated force, or abandon a campaign that has already cost Athens roughly 8,000 talents, more money than most cities see in a decade. Either option feels like betrayal. They choose to continue, because giving up now would mean admitting that all those deaths were meaningless. So the siege drags on, with sick men trying to maintain military discipline while their comrades die around them from a disease no one understands. Meanwhile, back in Athens, people are making desperate calculations. Should they send reinforcements to Potidea? But that means taking healthy soldiers away from a city that desperately needs them. Should they abandon the siege? But that means accepting a catastrophic loss for no gain whatsoever. Every decision is wrong. Every choice leads to more death. This is what strategic planning looks like when the fundamental assumptions about life and death have been shattered. You're witnessing something unprecedented in human history. A civilization trying to conduct a major war while simultaneously fighting for its very survival against biological catastrophe. The normal rules of warfare simply don't apply anymore. Traditional military thinking assumes that you can predict casualties, plan for logistics, maintain morale through leadership and shared purpose. But how do you maintain morale when your own city is a charnel house? How do you plan logistics when your supply lines are staffed by people who might drop dead at any moment? The Spartans, for their part, seem almost as disturbed by the plague as the Athenians themselves. When they hear reports of the disease spreading through Athens, many of them actually retreat from Attica. Even hardened warriors, trained from childhood to face death without flinching, are terrified of this invisible enemy. There's something deeply unsettling about watching your enemies flee, not from your strength, but from your suffering. It's a victory. Technically, the Spartan invasion has been repelled, but it's the most hollow victory imaginable. Well, not through courage or skill, but through sheer biological horror. The psychological impact on both sides is enormous. How do you celebrate driving off an enemy when the thing that drove them off is also destroying your own people? How do you claim divine favor when the gods have clearly abandoned you to pestilence? What's almost admirable, in a deeply twisted way, is how Athens continues to behave like a great power even while collapsing from within. They're still sending embassies to foreign courts, still making alliances, still planning grand strategies as if they were the same mighty empire they were a year ago. You watch delegations sail off to Thrace, seeking support from barbarian kings who probably won't even recognize the pale, traumatized diplomats as representatives of the same glorious Athens they once knew. These ambassadors carry with them not just political proposals, but potentially the plague itself, spreading the catastrophe to new lands. The sheer audacity is breathtaking. A city that can barely bury its own dead is still trying to orchestrate international coalitions, still maneuvering for advantage in a war that has already cost them more than any victory could possibly be worth. But maybe this persistence is the only thing keeping Athens from complete collapse. Maybe the act of continuing to behave like a great power, even when you're no longer sure you deserve the title, is what prevents total surrender to despair. Or maybe it's just madness. At this point, it's hard to tell the difference. The financial implications of the plague are staggering in ways that go far beyond the immediate costs of warfare. Athens has built its empire on trade, on the flow of goods and tribute from across the Mediterranean. But who wants to trade with a plague city? Merchant ships that once crowded the harbor at Piraeus now give Athens a wide berth. The tribute payments that have funded Athenian greatness slow to a trickle, as subject cities either can't or won't send their required contributions to a metropolis that might be cursed by the gods. The irony is that Athens still has enormous financial reserves, those famous 6,000 talents stored on the Acropolis that Pericles mentioned in his speeches. But what good is money when there's nothing to buy and no one to sell it? When your workforce is dead or dying, when your trade partners are fleeing, when your entire economic system is predicated on a level of social stability that no longer exists, you watch wealthy families literally giving away fortunes because money has become meaningless. What's the point of hoarding gold when you might be dead tomorrow? What's the value of property when half the city is abandoned? What's the use of investments when the future itself has become unpredictable? The slave markets collapse entirely. Who wants to buy slaves who might be carrying the plague? Who has the resources to feed and house additional people when they can barely care for their existing households? Even slavery, one of the fundamental institutions of ancient society, breaks down under the pressure of biological catastrophe. Marriage becomes almost meaningless when life expectancy has dropped to weeks or months. Why hold elaborate wedding ceremonies when the couple might not live to see their first anniversary? Why negotiate dowries when both families might be extinct before the contracts are fulfilled? The education of children stops almost entirely. Schools close as teachers die and parents become too focused on mere survival to worry about their children's intellectual development. An entire generation is growing up without formal education, without the cultural transmission that maintains civilization across time. Religious festivals, once the beating heart of Athenian community life, skinois, either disappear entirely or transform into desperate attempts to appease whatever angry gods might be causing this catastrophe. The Panathenaea, the great celebration of Athena and Athenian identity, becomes a grim gathering of survivors rather than a joyous community celebration. Even the legal system struggles to function. How do you conduct trials when judges, lawyers, and witnesses keep dying? How do you enforce contracts when both parties might be dead before the terms can be fulfilled? How do you maintain property rights when the owners have fled or perished? You're watching the complete breakdown of everything that makes a society work. Laws, customs, institutions, social bonds, all of it dissolving under the pressure of random, inexplicable death. The plague doesn't affect all parts of Athens equally, and this geographic inequality creates its own special horrors. The crowded areas near the harbor, where the refugees from the countryside have been packed together, become death traps where the disease spreads like wildfire. But the wealthy districts up on the hills, with their spacious homes and better sanitation, seem to offer some protection. This creates a cruel lottery where your social class helps determine your survival chances, not perfectly, since the plague kills rich and poor alike, but enough to add another layer of injustice to an already incomprehensible catastrophe. You watch as the city literally empties out in some areas, while others remain relatively populated. Entire neighborhoods become ghost towns, where the only sounds are the buzzing of flies and the occasional crash of buildings collapsing from neglect. The harbor area of Piraeus, once the bustling commercial heart of the empire, becomes particularly nightmarish. The combination of crowded conditions, poor sanitation, and constant influx of new people creates a perfect breeding ground for disease. Some people start to whisper that the Spartans must have poisoned the water supply, because how else could you explain such concentrated suffering? The roads leading out of the city become highways of desperation as people flee toward the countryside, carrying the plague with them to communities that have so far been spared. Rural areas that thought they were safe suddenly find themselves dealing with refugees who bring not just tales of urban horror, but the disease itself. Perhaps the most tragic aspect of this catastrophe is watching the cultural achievements of Athens. The philosophy, art, literature, and democratic ideals that will inspire humanity for millennia, threatened with complete extinction. Libraries are abandoned as their caretakers die, philosophical schools close as masters and students succumb to the plague. Artists stop creating because there's no market for beauty when everyone is focused on basic survival. The cultural momentum that has made Athens the intellectual center of the world grinds to a halt. You realize you're witnessing something that might be irreplaceable, disappearing forever. The accumulated wisdom of generations, the artistic techniques passed down from master to apprentice, the political innovations that have created the world's first democracy, all of it hanging by the thinnest possible thread. Some scholars and artists try to preserve what they can, frantically copying manuscripts or teaching their skills to anyone who will listen. But when you're fighting for your life against an invisible enemy, cultural preservation feels like a luxury you can't afford. The democratic assembly, when it meets at all, has become a shadow of its former self. Instead of grand debates about policy and philosophy, the discussions focus on the practical details of mass burial and disease prevention. The same space that once hosted Pericles' magnificent oratory now echoes with desperate discussions about body disposal and water purification. News of Athens' catastrophe spreads across the Greek world and beyond, creating ripple effects that will reshape the entire Mediterranean political landscape. Allied cities begin to question whether supporting Athens is wise when the city might not survive the year. Enemy states that have spent years fearing Athenian power suddenly see opportunity. If Athens is crippled by disease, why not settle old scores now? Why not reclaim territories that were taken by Athenian force when that force no longer exists? But there's also a strange hesitation among Athens' enemies. The plague is so horrific, so obviously beyond normal human experience that attacking Athens now feels almost like sacrilege. Even hardened warriors pause before striking at a city that the gods themselves seem to be destroying. The psychological impact on the entire Greek world is enormous. If Athens, mighty, seemingly blessed Athens, can be brought low by invisible forces, what does that say about human achievement in general? What does it mean for the other cities who have modeled themselves on Athenian success? Some communities impose strict quarantines, refusing to allow anyone from Athens to enter their territories. Others send humanitarian aid, though always at a safe distance. A few, perhaps wisely, simply pretend that Athens no longer exists and make their political calculations accordingly. Those who survive the initial waves of plague begin to develop new ways of living that would have been unthinkable before the catastrophe. Extended families split up to reduce the risk of total extinction. If one household is wiped out, maybe another branch will survive. People start hoarding not just food and water, but knowledge. They write down family histories, recipes, trade secrets, anything that might be lost if the current generation dies. Athens is creating an accidental archive of its own civilization, motivated not by scholarly interest, but by pure survival instinct. The survivors also develop a peculiar psychology, part paranoia, part reckless courage. Having faced the worst that fate can offer and lived through it, some people become almost superhuman in their confidence. Others become so risk-averse that they can barely function. Both responses are rational ways of dealing with trauma that defies comprehension. You notice that people who have recovered from the plague are treated with a mixture of awe and suspicion. Are they blessed by the gods or cursed? Are they immune to future disease or still dangerous to be around? No one knows, and the uncertainty creates yet another source of social tension. The Athenian military, what's left of it, begins to adapt to the reality of conducting warfare during a plague. New protocols emerge for handling sick soldiers, for maintaining unit cohesion when men are dying of disease rather than battle, for continuing campaigns when your own homeland might not exist by the time you return. Commanders start making calculations that would have been unthinkable before. Is it better to attack now with diseased troops who might infect the enemy, or wait for healthy reinforcements who might never come? Should sick soldiers be abandoned to prevent spreading the plague, or cared for regardless of the cost? The siege of Potidæa becomes a laboratory for these grim experiments. Athenian forces learn to function while disease decimates their ranks, developing new forms of military organization adapted to catastrophic mortality rates. They're inventing the logistics of biological warfare by accident, creating precedents that military theorists won't understand for centuries. Some innovations are purely practical: better sanitation, isolation of sick soldiers, new burial procedures that can handle massive casualties. Others are psychological, new forms of unit cohesion that can survive the loss of most personnel, new motivational techniques for men who expect to die soon anyway. Perhaps the most remarkable thing about this entire catastrophe is that some people maintain hope despite overwhelming evidence that the world is ending. They continue to plant crops they might not live to harvest, to make plans for futures they might not see, to behave as if normal life will eventually resume. This hope isn't rational. Any sensible person looking at the evidence would conclude that Athens is doomed. But it's this irrational optimism that keeps some semblance of society functioning. People continue to trade, to work, to maintain relationships, not because it makes sense, but because the alternative is complete surrender to despair. You see children playing in the streets between the corpse collection rounds, their games adapted to incorporate the reality of death, but still fundamentally recognizable as childhood activities. You watch elderly people carefully tending gardens, even though they probably won't live to see the harvest. You observe scholars continuing to debate philosophical questions, as if the answers might matter to someone, somewhere, someday. This stubborn persistence of normal human activities in the face of catastrophe is perhaps the most heroic thing you've witnessed. It's not the dramatic heroism of battlefield courage, but the quiet heroism of refusing to let horror define your entire existence. Throughout this nightmare, people keep asking the same question: why? What did Athens do to deserve this? What cosmic crime could justify such suffering? Some point to the war itself, arguing that the gods must disapprove of the conflict between Greek cities. Others blame specific acts of impiety, real or imagined offenses against divine law. A few suggest that this is punishment for Athens' imperial ambitions, divine retribution for ruling over other Greek cities. But these explanations don't really satisfy anyone. The plague affects the pious and the impious equally, kills children who couldn't possibly be guilty of any cosmic crime, and seems to operate according to no moral logic whatsoever. If this is divine justice, then the gods are either incompetent or malevolent. The alternative, that this is simply a natural disaster with no moral dimension at all, is almost more frightening than the idea of divine punishment. At least punishment implies some kind of cosmic order, some set of rules that can be understood and followed. Random catastrophe suggests that the universe is fundamentally chaotic and hostile to human flourishing. The people who survive this plague will carry its psychological scars for the rest of their lives. They've seen things that no human should have to see, learned truths about the fragility of civilization that can never be unlearned. This trauma will shape Athens' political and cultural development for generations. The confident optimism that characterized the early Golden Age will be replaced by a more cautious, pragmatic approach to governance. The faith in human reason and divine favor will be tempered by the knowledge of how quickly both can prove inadequate. Future Athenian leaders will make decisions haunted by the memory of how rapidly their great city nearly collapsed. Military strategies will be influenced by the understanding that biological catastrophe can be more devastating than any enemy army. Cultural productions will carry within them the echo of this brush with extinction. The survivors will tell their children and grandchildren about the plague years, but the stories will sound like myths rather than history. Future generations will struggle to believe that their glorious city really came so close to complete destruction, that their ancestors really lived through such horror. Even as Athens struggles with biological catastrophe, the machinery of war continues to function with a kind of bureaucratic momentum that defies rational explanation. Ships are still being built, soldiers are still being recruited, campaigns are still being planned. The naval expeditions continue to sail out from Piraeus, carrying Athenian power to distant shores, even as the home city crumbles. These fleets become floating cities, self-contained worlds where Athenian civilization continues to exist even when it's dying at home. You watch 100-ship expeditions departing for raids on Peloponnesian coastlines, and you can't decide whether this represents admirable determination or insane stubbornness. Are these expeditions heroic attempts to maintain Athenian greatness, or are they simply the final spasms of a dying empire? The answer probably depends on whether Athens survives the plague. If the city recovers, these naval campaigns will be remembered as proof of Athenian resilience. If Athens falls, they'll be seen as the desperate flailings of a doomed civilization. Either way, you're witnessing something unprecedented. A major military power continuing to project force abroad while fighting for its very existence at home. It's a strategy that probably shouldn't work, but somehow, incredibly, it does. Athens continues to win naval battles and raid enemy territories even while losing the war against an invisible biological enemy. The plague has shown you that everything you thought you knew about power, civilization, and human nature was incomplete. You've learned that the mightiest empire can be brought low by something too small to see, that the wisest leaders can be rendered helpless by forces they don't understand, that all human achievement is far more fragile than anyone wants to admit. But you've also learned that humans are capable of extraordinary persistence in the face of impossible odds, that civilization can continue to function even when its foundations are crumbling, that hope can survive even when hope makes no rational sense. As the second summer of plague draws to a close, with the death toll still climbing and no end in sight, you face a terrible question. Will Athens survive to see another year? And if it does, will it still be Athens? Or will it be something else entirely, a city shaped by trauma into something the world has never seen before? The war continues, the plague continues, and somehow, against all odds, life continues. But everything has changed, and there's no going back to the world that existed before the invisible enemy came to call. As the plague enters its third year, Pericles himself becomes its most prominent victim. The man who once stood before the assembled citizens and declared Athens the school of Hellas now lies dying of the same disease that has claimed so many of his people. But even death cannot break his sense of duty. In his final weeks, as his body succumbs to the familiar progression of symptoms, the fever, the pustules, the internal burning, he continues to offer counsel to the remaining leaders. His voice, once capable of swaying thousands with its eloquence, becomes a whisper as he struggles to share whatever wisdom might help Athens survive. You watch the city's reaction to his illness with a mixture of grief and dark irony. The same people who blamed him for the war, who fined him and stripped him of office in their rage and despair, now realize what they're about to lose. Pericles wasn't just a politician. He was the embodiment of Athenian greatness, was a living symbol of everything the city had achieved. His death marks more than the end of a life, it marks the end of an era. The golden age of Athens dies with him, not because no other leaders will emerge, but because the world that created and sustained such leadership no longer exists. The plague has killed not just people, but the very idea that human wisdom and noble character can overcome any challenge. The funeral is heartbreaking in its simplicity. No grand monuments, no elaborate ceremonies, no crowds of mourners, just another body wrapped in cloth, another name added to the endless lists of the dead. The man who helped create the Parthenon is buried in a mass grave. his greatness reduced to the same biological reality that claims beggars and slaves. What follows, Pericles' death, reveals something both admirable and terrifying about human nature: the capacity to continue functioning even when the reasons for functioning have disappeared. Athens keeps fighting the war not because anyone believes they can win anymore, but because stopping would mean admitting that everything has been meaningless. You watch new expeditions sail out from Piraeus, carrying soldiers who might themselves be infected to spread the plague to new territories. The siege of Potidæa finally ends, not through military victory, but through biological exhaustion. The defenders, starved and desperate, surrender when they literally start eating each other. The terms of surrender are almost comically generous considering the circumstances. The Potidæans are allowed to leave with their families, their possessions, even money for travel. Why such mercy? Because Athens no longer has the manpower to properly garrison a conquered city. And frankly, no one wants to inherit a place associated with such horror. The Athenian generals who grant these terms are later blamed by the assembly for being too lenient. The same assembly that can barely muster a quorum because so many members are dead criticizes military leaders for not being harsh enough with enemies who surrendered a city that cost Athens 2,000 talents and thousands of lives. This is what political discourse looks like after trauma: rational decision-making replaced by the need to blame someone, anyone, for losses that defy comprehension. By now, a strange new class of people has emerged in Athens, the plague survivors. They walk through the city with a peculiar confidence, as if having faced the worst fate can offer and lived through it has made them invincible. In some way, they're right. They probably are immune to reinfection. But this immunity comes with its own psychological burden. The survivors carry within themselves the memory of watching everyone around them die while they inexplicably lived. Why them? Why not their spouses, their children, their parents? There's no answer that makes sense, and the randomness of survival creates a guilt that will haunt them forever. You notice how differently the survivors interact with the world. They're either recklessly brave, having faced death and won. What else could possibly scare them? Or pathologically cautious, hyper-aware of every potential threat because they know how quickly everything can be lost. Some survivors develop an almost manic need to rebuild, to create, to restore what was lost. Others become fatalistic, going through the motions of life without any real investment in the future. Both responses are rational ways of dealing with trauma that has no precedent in human experience. The children who survive are perhaps the most changed. They've grown up in a world where death is random and constant, where adults can't protect them, where the gods offer no comfort. What kind of society will they create when they come of age? What values will they pass on to their own children? News of Athens' catastrophe spreads throughout the Mediterranean world, fundamentally altering the balance of power in ways that will be felt for generations. Allied cities that once paid tribute eagerly now question whether supporting Athens is wise when the city might not survive another year. Enemy states watch with a mixture of satisfaction and unease. Yes, their great rival has been brought low, but not through their own efforts. There's something unsettling about winning a conflict because your enemy was destroyed by forces beyond human control. Victory feels hollow when it comes through biological catastrophe rather than military superiority. Some foreign observers draw the obvious lesson: if Athens can be destroyed by disease, so can they. The plague serves as a reminder that all human achievement is fragile, that the mightiest empires can be brought low by forces too small to see. This knowledge will influence international politics for centuries, creating a new awareness of how quickly power can shift due to factors beyond political or military control. Others see opportunity. If Athens is weakened, why not settle old scores now? Why not reclaim territories that were taken by Athenian force when that force no longer exists? The plague creates a power vacuum that ambitious neighbors are eager to fill. The financial implications of the plague extend far beyond Athens itself. The city has been the economic hub of the Eastern Mediterranean, the center of trade networks that span from the Black Sea to Egypt. When Athens collapses, those networks collapse with it. Merchant ships that once crowded the harbor at Piraeus now avoid the port entirely. Who wants to risk carrying the plague to their home cities? Who wants to trade with people who might all be dead by the time the contract is fulfilled? The economic isolation becomes self-reinforcing. The less trade Athens conducts, the less attractive it becomes as a trading partner. The tribute system that has funded Athenian greatness effectively ends. Subject cities either can't or won't send their required payments to a metropolis that might be cursed by the gods. Some openly revolt, betting that Athens no longer has the strength to punish defiance. They're mostly right. What's left of the Athenian treasury, those famous 6,000 talents stored on the Acropolis, sits largely unused because there's nothing to buy and no one to sell it to. Money becomes meaningless when the social structures that give it value have collapsed. Perhaps the most tragic long-term consequence of the plague is the cultural damage it inflicts. Athens has been the intellectual center of the Greek world, home to philosophers, artists, and thinkers whose ideas will influence humanity for millennia. Much of that intellectual tradition dies with the plague victims. Libraries are abandoned as their caretakers succumb to disease. Philosophical schools close when masters and students alike fall ill. Artistic techniques passed down through generations are lost when the craftsmen who hold them die without successors. The democratic institutions that have made Athens famous begin to function differently, if at all. Assembly meetings become focused on practical survival rather than grand political theory. The sophisticated debate culture that once characterized Athenian politics is replaced by desperate arguments over resource allocation and disease prevention. You're witnessing the near destruction of one of humanity's greatest cultural achievements. The ideas and institutions that will eventually inspire Renaissance humanism, Enlightenment democracy, and modern concepts of citizenship are hanging by the thinnest possible thread. Throughout the plague years, people keep asking the same fundamental question: have the gods abandoned Athens? The traditional religious explanations for disaster, divine punishment for specific sins, cosmic justice for moral failings, don't seem to fit the random, indiscriminate nature of the plague. The disease kills the pious and impious equally, affects the morally upright and the corrupt with the same devastating efficiency. If this is divine justice, then the gods are either incompetent or operating according to logic that humans cannot comprehend. Some people conclude that the gods must be dead themselves. destroyed by whatever cosmic catastrophe has allowed such random suffering to exist. Others decide that the gods are actively malevolent, that humanity is being punished for crimes they don't remember committing. A few maintain their faith through sheer stubborn determination, insisting that this must all be part of some greater divine plan that mortals simply cannot understand. But even these faithful believers admit they have no idea what that plan might be. The religious vacuum created by the plague will eventually be filled by new philosophies, new ways of understanding the world that don't rely on traditional concepts of divine protection. But in the moment, you're living through the collapse of an entire worldview, watching a people lose their faith in real time, despite everything: the death, the social collapse, the economic ruin, the cultural destruction. Life somehow continues. People still fall in love, still have children, still make plans for futures they might not live to see. This persistence of normal human activities in the face of catastrophe is perhaps the most remarkable thing you've witnessed. Children play in the streets between corpse collection rounds, their games adapted to incorporate the reality of death, but still fundamentally recognizable as childhood activities. Elderly people tend gardens even though they probably won't live to see the harvest. Scholars continue to debate philosophical questions as if the answers might matter to someone, somewhere, someday. This stubborn refusal to let horror define existence entirely is what keeps some semblance of civilization functioning. It's not dramatic heroism, it's the quiet heroism of continuing to be human when humanity itself seems pointless. The Athenian military, what's left of it, has been forced to develop entirely new ways of conducting warfare. They've learned to maintain unique cohesion when half the soldiers are dead or dying, to continue campaigns when supply lines are staffed by people who might drop dead at any moment, to plan strategies that account for catastrophic mortality rates. These innovations, born from desperation, will influence military thinking for generations. Future commanders will study how Athens managed to project naval power while fighting for its very survival, how military organizations can adapt to biological catastrophe, how warfare can continue when the normal assumptions about life and death have been shattered. The siege of Patelia has become a case study in how to conduct military operations during a plague. The lessons learned there about sanitation, about isolating sick soldiers, about maintaining morale when disease is more dangerous than the enemy, will prove valuable in future conflicts. The Democratic Assembly, when it meets at all, has become something entirely different from what it was during the Golden Age. Instead of grand debates about justice and virtue, the discussions focus on practical matters of survival: where to bury the dead, how to distribute what food remained, whether to continue funding military expeditions that might never return. The sophisticated rhetorical culture that once characterized Athenian politics has been replaced by a more brutal pragmatism. Citizens who once prided themselves on their ability to craft elegant arguments now simply want to know who's responsible for cleaning up the corpses. This transformation isn't necessarily negative. The democracy that emerges from the plague will be more focused on practical governance and less prone to the kind of idealistic overreach that contributed to Athens's problems. But it's a fundamentally different institution, shaped by trauma in ways that will influence its character for generations. As you stand at what remains of the Agora, looking out over a city that bears little resemblance to the glorious Athens of just a few years ago, you're forced to confront some uncomfortable truths about human civilization. Everything you thought was permanent, the buildings, the institutions, the social bonds that held your community together, has proven to be far more fragile than anyone imagined. The plague has demonstrated that all human achievement exists at the mercy of forces beyond our control or understanding. But you've also learned something else, that humans are capable of extraordinary resilience in the face of impossible circumstances. Athens has lost perhaps a third of its population, seen its economy collapse, watched its political system transform beyond recognition, and yet it continues to exist. The city that emerges from this catastrophe will be different from the one that entered it. The confident optimism that characterized the early Golden Age has been replaced by a harder, more realistic understanding of human limitations. The faith in divine protection has been shattered, replaced by a more self-reliant approach to survival. The plague will end. Eventually, the immediate crisis will pass, and Athens will begin the long process of rebuilding. But the psychological scars will remain for generations. The people who lived through this horror will never again believe that civilization is secure, that progress is inevitable, that human wisdom is sufficient to overcome any challenge. This knowledge will influence every aspect of Athenian culture for centuries to come. The plays of Sophocles and Euripides will carry within them the echo of this brush with extinction. The philosophy of Plato and Aristotle will be shaped by questions raised during the plague years. The political theories that will eventually influence modern democracy will bear the mark of this trauma. Future generations will struggle to understand how their ancestors survived such catastrophe. The stories will be told and retold, each generation adding their own interpretation to events that defy easy explanation. Some will see divine punishment, others random biological disaster. Still others, a test of human character. What's most remarkable about this entire catastrophe is that Athens refuses to surrender. Even with a third of the population dead, even with the economy in ruins, even with their greatest leader gone and their allies abandoning them, they keep fighting. They continue to send out naval expeditions, to maintain their empire, to behave like a great power. This stubborn persistence probably shouldn't work, but somehow it does. Athens continues to win battles, to inspire fear in its enemies, to command respect on the international stage. The gap between their internal reality and external perception becomes almost comical. A city on the verge of collapse, continuing to act like the master of the Mediterranean. But maybe this refusal to accept defeat is what ultimately saves Athens. Maybe the act of continuing to behave like a great power, even when you're no longer sure you deserve the title, is what prevents total collapse into chaos and despair. You realize that you've witnessed the end of something precious, the kind of innocent confidence that allows a civilization to believe it can achieve anything. The Athens that emerges from the plague will be wiser in some ways, more realistic about human limitations, less prone to the kind of overreach that leads to disaster, but it will also be sadder, more cynical, less willing to attempt the kind of grand projects that once made Athens great. The plague has taught harsh lessons about the fragility of human achievement, and those lessons cannot be unlearned. The children who grow up in post-plague Athens will be different from their parents, harder, more practically, less likely to believe in grand narratives about human progress. They'll create great things in their own right, but they'll do so with the knowledge that everything can be lost in an instant. Sweet dreams, great statesman of Athens. Your vision of a city that would be the school of Hellas survived even when you did not, even when the plague tried to destroy everything you built. The democracy you nurtured, the culture you fostered, the empire you expanded, all of it endured the worst biological catastrophe in recorded history and emerged transformed but unbroken. The lessons of those plague years still echo through history, reminding us that civilization is far more fragile than we like to believe, but also far more resilient than we dare to hope. Athens learned that human achievement means nothing when biology turns against us, but also that the human spirit can endure unimaginable suffering and continue to create beauty, wisdom, and meaning. Your city became something you never intended it to be, not just a beacon of culture and democracy, but a testament to the stubborn refusal of human beings to surrender to despair. No matter how overwhelming the circumstances, the plague that tried to destroy Athens ultimately revealed the deepest truth about civilization. It exists not because it's permanent, but because each generation chooses to rebuild it, again and again, in defiance of everything that would tear it down. And tomorrow the sun will rise over a changed world, where those who survived the unthinkable must decide what kind of future to build from the ashes of everything they once believed was eternal.